Being recorded, I'll turn things over to you, Kofi.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, good evening, everyone. This is my first webinar experience, so I hope we have no technical difficulties. I would suggest for some of the slides, people consider hitting full screen mode because I've got a few charts and statistics to come up and may be very difficult with it just as a tiny box in the top left hand to see it. On that note, I will go ahead and start. Yes, again, thank you for tuning in tonight. I thought I'd start a little bit as we get into this really weighted topic around the future of the United Church and what the future will bring, just to talk a little bit about myself, and because I think some of my conclusions may be controversial, but just to give a background to kind of my life in the United Church and how I've gotten these reflections. So as you can see from the picture on screen, that's me at the local United Church that was across the road from where I was living when we were out in Kent County in Chatham, Ontario. And so, I've been a United Church member my entire life. When I was younger, we lived in rural Canada, and so got firsthand to know what it was like in those communities where the UCC is kind of a cornerstone of local life. And you can see me at Cub Scouts. As a teenager, I moved to Mississauga and was very involved in Erin Mills United Church through the Teen Talk and the different types of activities there. This is a picture that's from the Oasis Youth Drop-In, which was a drop-in program created at our church, which served young people from the local community. And that picture is just some of the staff and different individuals there. Actually, the young lady in the pink is my sister. Can't pull my little pointer, but that's all right. And following my time at Air Mills United, where I ended up being the director of their youth outreach program, I went on to becoming involved in national church life. So, as was mentioned, from 2006 to 2007, I was running a program called Youth Connections, which had me traveling to churches across Canada. In the top left, you can see myself and the then moderator, David Giuliano, when we went to go visit UCC community in Iqaluit in Nunavut. And in the bottom right program is an event that we held where we brought together youth leaders within the United Church, within Muslim communities, within First Nation and Inuit communities, and within Blacks communities in Toronto, and had a really amazing weekend of sharing and thinking about how interculturally we could work for social justice. So that was a big part of the work there. And during that, I got to really get to know Church House and also speak to congregations really from coast to coast. And as I went off to Oxford, I was still involved in UCC life, in one way because I was studying the church and using church's global partnerships and the work of the church in anti-apartheid as a focus for my PhD, so kind of academic reflection about the church, but also was involved through the Youth for Peace initiative, and you can see a picture of me there in Palestine, in Bethlehem, walking along the separation wall, which was a program I took part of in 2009 with about 11 other members of the church. And then, kind of my last little slide about my life in the church, and that's me at EMUC when my wife Lisa and I were married in the church 3 years ago. So really, I've had a lifetime of experiences within the church, whether at the congregational level, whether at the national level, or academic experience. And it's based on these experiences and a great love for my time in the church that I base kind of the realities I would like to talk about tonight, which are not necessarily the most pleasant topics for those who care about the UCC, but I think are just a necessary reality. And my hope is to have a space where we can really talk about some of the challenges the church faces and creative solutions for moving forward. But I'll do that by really talking about the reality of the church, and then through my own observations, what I think are some of the key barriers that have stopped the church from making some of the changes needed to better meet the spiritual realities of 21st century Canada. So I'll start a little bit by something we may all be familiar with, and that's the reality of UCC decline. Now, I would suggest you hit full screen for this, but this is a very illustrative figure that was put in the National Post. And you can see at the top, it kind of tracks membership, looking at our peak in the mid 60s and the kind of almost constant decline ever since. And below it, we have Sunday school attendance, and we can see how that's been going down to very low levels and is projected to continue that way up to 2015. And we also see Sunday school membership. And so this is not something that is new, the fact that United Church membership has been declining. But I think charts like this, for me, really illustrate the extent to this decline and how quickly we could be facing becoming a very tiny denomination. Now, there's a man named Reginald Bibby, who is someone that you may want to follow up with, who's one of the foremost sociologists in Canada who's been studying churches. And I'll move on to the next slide. And this is around church attendance in Canada. And you can see here that in some ways, the drop in church attendance has kind of paralleled the drop in the UCC. But as Bibby points out in his own work, while it seems that church attendance going down from a high point of 58% in Canada and all denominations in the 1950s, by the 1990s it hit about 31%, though Bibby says it could be more like 24%. But either way, he and others have noted that there's been a stabilization in church decline, that church numbers, the amount of people attending churches on a Sunday, hasn't actually changed that drastically from the 90s to the 2000s. So this kind of societal trend of Canadians spending less and less time on Sunday mornings in church has seemed to stabilize. The kind of scary statistic is it hasn't for the UCC, that as far as the numbers we've seen from that earlier chart, the decline of the UCC has continued. And Bibby, in his different articles on the topic, has spoken about that. And he gives a couple reasons. And he said, I'll just stay here. I mean, one of the things he's talked about is how immigration has helped stabilize the Catholic Church. So that's one of the reasons that church hasn't declined. And he's also talked about how growth in evangelical churches has helped kind of stabilize church attendance numbers in the 1930s. But he's noted that with the Anglican Church, the United Church, what they call the mainline churches, that they haven't had anything, they haven't had an increase in number or an increase in support from new immigrants to Canada. And so their trends are continuing on decline. And Bibby himself says within about 10 years, the UCC could be, as he quotes, on life support. Now, the other interesting thing about Bibby's articles is that he's in depth polled young people and teenagers across Canada to ask them about their feelings about faith and religion. And probably the most disturbing fact he found was that the United Church, the Anglican Church, and the Catholic Church were specifically notorious for not appealing to teenagers. And that teenagers specifically wrote that these three churches were churches that they simply couldn't relate to. His prime example is the fact that in the 1950s, 10% of all teenagers in Canada said they were part of the United Church. Today, it's barely 1%. And that's happening even though 8% of teenagers live in homes that are United Church households. So he's kind of said that this is maybe the largest negative stat or trend that we need to pay attention to, because if the vast majority of young people raised in United Church homes don't relate with the United Church, then that's really saying something about where our future is and whether or not we'll actually be able to maintain any numbers as the baby boomer generation becomes less and less present in the church. But it looks like young people will not be taking their places. Now, just really quick, we can look here, and I've just pulled up some stats around regular church attendance in Western countries. And this poll was based on people themselves saying what they believed was how often they went to church. So a lot of people have said people have probably inflated it. But as we can see, Canada is kind of this representative sample towards actually the higher end. That in other Western countries like Sweden or Australia or the UK, attendance levels have been declining for a generation and are much lower than they are in Canada. So from a global population, a global perspective, we can say that yes, UCC attendance, or not UCC, but Canadian church attendance in general is all right. It's not as bad as other countries. But if we're looking at other Western countries as a baseline to follow, actually it's quite worrisome. And I noticed that from my time living in the UK and the European Union myself, that you go around these communities with beautiful, beautiful churches, and they're almost all empty. And to me, that seems to be very prophetic for the future of the UCC and what may happen. So that brings us to the question of really, well, and I think a lot of folks have been asking this across Canada, where do we go from here? What is the future for our denomination? And for me, the more important question is kind of when we're thinking about why are we church, why are we called to be the church, is to what end? I understand there's kind of a loyalty to the denomination and a love for the denomination, but to me the bigger question is, well, why are we called to be church? And there's a few different arguments for that, which I won't go through very much in depth, but one is the social capital argument by a man named Robert Putnam, who argues that institutions like churches or trade unions or NGOs have been an essential part of life in the West in building connection between people and building social trust. And he's written about how, as people have spent less time in organizations, whether they're churches or secular groups, how actually people's perception of trusting others in society has gone down. So his argument is that we need churches and we need people being part of church life because in part it helps build the strength of our societies by helping us to get to know our neighbors, to trust others, and kind of come together with common purpose. There's also, of course, an argument that, well, why are we church? Because it's tradition, because it was passed on to us as part of our heritage from our forefathers and foremothers, and we need to keep that there. There's also arguments that there's pastoral care that congregations provide that is essential to continue having there, especially as we're an aging population. There's also, for folks who realize, and I'm one of them, that so many of our progressive movements, whether they're NGOs, whether it's the women's liberation movement or the movement against slavery, to even the movement to end apartheid, were based first in Christian churches. And so that churches are an essential part of this task, I think, of building the kingdom, and that meaning working towards social justice in society. And finally, there, of course, is the idea that we are called to be church because we were given a great commission by Jesus and by God, and we have a spiritual journey to build churches and to be part of church life. And so I think those are all valid reasons on why we should be church and why it's so important to keep the church functioning. What I don't think are necessarily the best arguments for why to be church are this feeling that we do it specifically for numbers, that we're into being the biggest denomination, and my limited understanding of the formation of the United Church was that this was a major piece to why people wanted to come together to build this kind of super Protestant denomination, which could be a voice for all Protestants in Canada. I don't know if that, to me, is really the major motivation by why we're called to be church. I certainly don't think we're called to be church primarily to have fancy buildings. Those places of worship are great and can be spiritually enlightening to be in. I don't think that is at the end why we're called to be church, nor do I really feel that church should be there to serve just our members, or that we're really following what it means to be church if we're going to church simply to feel safe and reassured in our lives as they are. For me, church should always have an element of spiritual challenge and struggle that is pushing us to better ourselves and our communities. So that's just a little bit about the kind of reality of church decline in the West and in the UCC, and also kind of, well, why are we called to be church? Now, my take on what's happening in the UCC is what I call this kind of self-reinforcing cycle of church decline. And this is based on my own research and just talking to folks across the country. And my argument goes a little bit like this. that as numbers have been declining in the UCC, this has led to a kind of an atmosphere of fear taking hold, and people really worrying and thinking, oh my goodness, the church could face collapse within a generation. And I think this then becomes a self-reinforcing cycle, because what that tends to do more often than not is then make folks focus very inwardly on, well, how do we maintain what we have? How do we keep the status quo? And in many ways, I find that makes people even more averse to taking risks with services, taking risks with what church does, taking risks with political stances. And why I call this a cycle is because I think it's that very fear and aversion from risk that kind of stifles the ability for our church to innovate and change and grow. And in return, because we aren't doing that, people are not coming, and our decline continues, which leads to more fear, which leads to less innovation. And I think we're caught in this really difficult cycle. And so to me, it's a question of how do we break that cycle and move beyond it? Unfortunately, I think there's a few more factors in play that are behind why it's so difficult for the church to change and innovate as it needs to. I guess, though, as I get into those factors, I give my hypothesis. And my hypothesis is as such, that the United Church of Canada is still based on a model that fit its time when it was created, kind of pre-World War II, or immediately following the kind of 1950s and 60s. But that's a model that simply no longer works in today's contemporary Canada. And while there are many great things about the UCC, the way we're structured and the way we do church simply is not meeting where our society has moved on to. And there is a real and ever-present need for systemic change at kind of all levels to bring new life and new enthusiasm and new members back into the church. But to get there, there are a few problems that are in the way. And I'm conscious of time and really want to spend time for discussion, but I'll just go over kind of the top 8 points that have come up to me from my travels and my experiences, and I hope maybe we can grapple with and problem solve around during the discussion time. So I've listed them there, but I'll just go through them one by one. So one of the things I find that is a major cause for this disengagement from church by Canadians as a whole, but specifically talking to young people across Canada, has to do with the worship style that is seen in many contemporary UCCs. And, this isn't just from hearing from people that people are saying the worship is not engaging, but this has also been my own experience, I'll have to admit, that, I'm someone who's been very lucky to have had many powerful religious experiences, kind of all over the world. I've had them with First Nations elders in Swetchlood in Saskatchewan. I've had them in the mountains of South Africa with friends of mine from the townships who were Rastafarians and were teaching me about kind of their indigenous heritage in South Africa. I've had it in churches in Zambia and different parts of Southern Africa, or churches in Palestine. And I've even had very deep spiritual experiences during the year we were living in London, England, when we went to what I would have to call a progressive evangelical church. And in all these places, I've really felt the Spirit there. And you know what? I've also felt the Spirit move at some United Church conferences, one of the general councils I was at, and some of the Faith in Cities. But I'd have to say it's been very rare, if almost never happened, that I've really had that feeling of Spirit and engagement and presence of the Lord in a normal UCC Sunday. And for me, that's very worrisome. And, I think, and this is just from having gone to other churches, that it's just almost incredible the difference to how people relate to church, where there is a style that is based on a praise band, where there is a style that isn't simply about a very theological or head-based approach to worship, but where people can actually stand up and use their hands, use their whole bodies, sing with all of their voices. And it's just, for me, when I think of, the few evangelical churches I've been to, who my good friends in the UCC will say, well, they have horrible theology and, they don't really, their view on God is incorrect. And I would probably agree with that. But, I remember the last time I was in evangelical church in Toronto, and they had a praise band going, and all of the little kids, as soon as it started, left their pews, ran to the center of the church and were simply there dancing and jumping and just surrounded by that love and presence of God. And for me, having been in my progressive evangelical congregation in London, which was multicultural, which was full of young people, I really saw that when you have a worship style that is engaging with praise band, with drums, with guitar, with some people standing and holding their hands while they're singing, but then when that's coupled with a progressive theology, which this church had, that you can have such a holistic faith experience that deeply motivated the young people who went there, including myself and my wife, to continue going every week. And so I think one of the first places we need to think about when it comes to how do we get Canadians back into our churches is how do we make our worship more engaging and more able to meet their spiritual needs. And certainly I know when I speak to people of African or Caribbean heritage who may, at a level of theology, agree with the UCC, when I invite them to come out, what they always say to me is, that church, Kofi, no, it's too boring. We just have to sit there and sing and we can't even stand up and express ourselves. I'm sorry, I just can't do it. And so to me, this is one of the major pieces, and there's not necessarily an answer to this, but really to me the answer is how do we move to a place where we can be much more daring and much more experimental in our worship services and find the different styles of worship that engage Canadians in our local communities. There's no kind of cookie cutter solution, but part of it is having a Sunday where we're innovating and where we're constantly trying new things. And in some churches, and I would agree, the approach may be having two services, having a service earlier that's more traditional and is steeped in the kind of heritage of UCC, which I know works very well for my grandmother and my great aunt and other people in my family who are staunch UCC supporters, but then thinking about perhaps in the evening a more youth-focused or more experimental service where we are able to try different worship styles. And that's something we're and a group of people I'm gathering with in Toronto are trying to do actually over the summer, and I'll speak more about that at the end. The second issue that I think is critical to the UCC and that has to be overcome if we're to have a future of regeneration and regrowth is around diversity. And this area is really, really important. Now, as Reginald Bibby talks about, up until, say, the 1980s or so, the UCC, one of the things that really helped buoy the numbers and grow the numbers of the church was the fact that the church relied on new immigrants from the United Kingdom to join local United Church congregations. But as immigration trends have changed and immigrants from the British Isles have decreased, we found the new immigrant communities, whether they're from Africa, Latin America, Caribbean, or Philippines, or even other parts of Europe, have not found a place in United Church congregations and have gone to different denominations. And, you know, this to me is something we have to figure out how we're going to get a handle on. And some folks, you know, I've had the feeling in the past, really feeling this whole idea about ethnic ministries and intercultural church is something we do because it's politically correct, because, you know, that's the nice thing to do. But especially through my time in the UK, I've come to realize that, no, being an intercultural church is the key piece to our survival. And I'll give an example. In London, England, at the moment, according to a BBC study, 60% of all of the people in London, England, who attend churches are either of African or Caribbean heritage. And you see that all across London, these amazing Methodist and other wonderful cathedrals that are filled now by vibrant and young African and Caribbean populations. And when you look at the UK, it's something like 3 or 4 times the rate of church participation by black people living in the UK than other populations. And so when we think about the future of Canada, and we look at the StatsCan for 2031, where it says 32% of the population in Canada will be visible minorities, where the two major visible minority Christian populations, the black population and Filipino population, will be doubling in size. There'll be over 1 million black Canadians. When we see our First Nations and Inuit populations growing quickly, it's pretty clear to me that if we're to be a church of growth, if we're to be a church of expansion, we have to be an intercultural church. And I know it's difficult and it's not easy, but I've always said, you know, as in partly in jest, that the Conservative Party of Canada understood how important it was to be intercultural and to grow from it before the United Church of Canada has actually understood that. And we've seen in the last election how a real focused effort by the Conservative Party to expand its base to a more intercultural one has run dividends for them. And it's still confounded me on why in the UCC we haven't been able to kind of get the same message. But also, how do we build intercultural spaces where people from different backgrounds feel comfortable? That is the challenge. And I'm happy to talk about that a little more. But let me move on to some of the other factors. The third factor I want to talk about is evangelism, which I've found for many folks in the church is a very touchy term. And I understand it's a very loaded term which has a Christian history that many folks are not comfortable with. On the other hand, I really feel that in the UCC, if we don't get a handle on evangelism or recruitment, on how we invite new folks to become part of our church and develop a strategy that's effective for it, we simply will not get people in the future. And I've put up Emerging Spirit, and I'm someone who wasn't a big fan of Emerging Spirit before, but to me, that's a good example of the UCC in contemporary times trying evangelism and not really getting it right. I think there were a few things about Emerging Spirit that were really critical flaws. I mean, one of the parts, I believe, was the demographic it focused on, which was mainly, to be frank, kind of white, middle-class, middle-aged baby boomers, the so-called lost generation, whose parents were in the church but did not continue in. And that was the focus. And I really have questions on whether that group of people are actually going to return to the UCC based on, a cool ad with bogglehead Jesus or more welcoming committees or that sort of things. But even more disturbing to me about Emerging Spirit was not the approach they took, because there were many great parts like welcoming classes and that sort of thing, but the pieces that were missing, specifically that the intercultural piece was missing, and it didn't get added on till later. Specifically because the way the church was presented did not really focus on the amazing work we're doing in social justice or transforming lives of people, or our great work with global partners, or how we're one of the most socially progressive churches in the world, if not the most. That was left aside, and almost exclusively we focused on this Wonder Cafe logo, the fact that we're an open church that has questioning and different ideas. And to me, that's a great quality of the church, but that's not a clear identity to build on. Now, just to go back to evangelism, though, these are my thoughts on this. I think we are in essential need of a policy around evangelism or recruitment in the UCC. And I think it has to be local and based in local context. It can't be a national thing. But I think there may be some basic principles that could be put forward that would allow people to, that would allow people to be comfortable with it. And I think the first would be no proselytization. That we should say openly as a church that as we're going out to recruit and bring others into our midst, that we are not trying to convert people of other religions to the UCC, and that we're going to, exclusively focus on appealing to people of no faith or of a Christian faith that may be disillusioned with their current denomination. And the second part is I think that we should base within that policy the best part of Emerging Spirit, which was classes and courses to help people be more welcoming. And the third thing I think we need to do is really make it targeted and empower evangelism or recruitment or whatever we want to call it to happen at a local level. Again, it can't be a national campaign, but it really needs to give resources to people at the local level to go out there and speak to people and try to bring them in their midst in a way that works in their context. But it can't be a plan cooked up in Toronto and tried to be rolled out all across the country. The next piece I wanted to speak about is identity. And I think this is one of the struggles that I saw kind of all across the UCC. And that was that struggle to try to figure out, what does it mean to be part of the United Church? And historically, there's been this idea that we are the big tent church, that we were a church that would have left and right, that would have conservative and progressive all under one roof. And to me, that's one of the models that may have worked in previous generations that simply isn't working today. So, for example, I think of the church, United Church as I know it here in the GTA, where in this case, when you speak to folks in the church or outside of it, there's pretty clear ideas around what the identity is of the United Church. It's known as being one of the few churches that welcomes the LGBTQ community. It's known as one of the churches that is out there, being involved in different kind of progressive social activism. And it's known as a church for its inclusiveness and its openness. But one of the things I was, or sorry, I'll back up for a minute. So that's the identity as I understand it in the GTA. But one of the things I learned when I was in the UK, when I went to this progressive evangelical church for a year, was how many young people there who'd been raised Baptist or raised Pentecostal, who were at this church because they had gone as young people raised as Christians, going to church every Sunday, and when they reached their 20s, realized that their politics and values did not match the theology of their church. And so this church for them was a total jump in a new direction to try to reconcile their faith with their politics. And some of my friends have pointed out that in many evangelical blogs, this is a major concern in evangelical circles in the United States, that their young people do not share the values of the elders and leaders of their church, and that they may lose these young people to the mainline churches. And to me, this is one of the greatest places and potential for growth in our church, is by finding those progressive Christians of all colors, shapes, and sizes all across the country who don't feel there's a church that can match their political beliefs or their social beliefs. And I think the UCC is that church. But one of the problems is that the UCC is that church in some cases, but in other cases we're not. And that's one of the things I found really shocking and surprising traveling across Canada, was to realize how different the worldviews are and the theology within our church. That we go from churches that are totally attached to welcoming people of other sexual orientations into their churches, to speaking to ministers that said we would never be allowed to do a gay marriage in our church because our congregation would not stand for it. And to me, this is one of the major pieces that makes recruitment hard, that makes worship style, that makes anything hard, because we're trying to be a national denomination where we don't all share the same core values. And certainly in church house and in church national circles, I could see how there was this constant power struggle and politicking and whispered conversations about people on the more progressive end and people perceived on the more conservative end, kind of fighting for control of church policy and where the church is going to go. And to me, if we look at everything people have written about religion and how religions flourish, the religions that flourish in modern times are ones that give their members a clear collective identity, a shared sense of identity that is separate from the larger society, sometimes in opposition, but sometimes simply separate, that it's a different way to view the world than secular life. And part of that, and for it able to happen, is that the church itself needs to be clear about what are the core values. Not that there's a doctrine that's rigidly enforced, but some core values that bring people together with a specific worldview. And I believe, and that's why I use this Wonder Cafe image, that if we're a church where our most clearest identifying factor is the fact that we ask a lot of questions and that we have different opinions, that may be great and open and may work very well for a book club or a discussion group. But for a church, that's a very slippery slope to try to invite folks in for. It's not that folks want answers spelled out for them, but folks are looking for deep spiritual values. And I think it's hard for the UCC to do any kind of mass scale recruiting or evangelism when our differences are so stark. I'll speak some more about that later, but let me move on to the next point. We already went to that. And this is around buildings. Now, this is something I think everyone knows, that the UCC has far more buildings now than we have people. And this was certainly a trend I saw in so many churches where instead of focusing on revitalizing themselves or being relevant to community, we had united churches that were so caught up in trying to maintain buildings that they couldn't afford. And I've used this little picture here of what the plan is for Bloor Street United, where they're saying they're going to build church house. And, I don't think I have to say much more because I'm sure people are very aware of it. But to me, there's a pressing need for us to come to grips with what we do with all of these buildings we have, which may have been a blessing in past generations, but now are holding us down. And in some ways, it seems like it would be great if we could really do decisive action while we had the power now to say perhaps we need to en masse close churches and merge congregations. We have to sell some of the land. We should lease it, for housing or other income-generating pieces to support the churches that are flourishing. We need to expand the expanding ones, and maybe take, some of the ones that are still surviving but maybe have too much space and turn them into mixed-use centers for community building and community growth. Unfortunately, as we know, we don't have a system like the Catholics where something like that could simply be ordered down from on high. But what we're left with is a situation is where it seems congregation after congregation are left to fend for themselves and left without really much support in thinking how to move forward with this reality of the buildings they have. And it just hurts my heart when I see like my grandparents and great aunt in their church in Weston, in Etobicoke, and they realize now in the meetings that their church is going to close. And that this church, that their whole community, and they saw over the last 80 years, put time into the stained glass, put time into the pews, is now going to be lost. And this is happening all over the country. And on the other hand, it befuddles me because we have, if we look at our churches, billions of dollars in real estate available to us. So there's a real question is how can we move from being bogged down to our buildings by using our buildings as a point of strength and empowerment. I'm going to just go to the last 2 points quickly so we can have discussion. One of the things that I spoke about before is the culture of fear. But beyond that, I find that one of the things, and many people when I was doing interviews around activism in the United Church for my PhD thesis said, was feeling stifled by a UCC culture that almost as a default always goes to kind of the path of least resistance. And I think inclusion and safety and discernment and all these things we do at our church gatherings, and I've been to many national gatherings, are great, but to a point, and to what end? And many times I see our obsession with making sure everyone's included and making sure everyone is comfortable and making sure we're, discerning through these processes actually as being tools that stifle dissent and stop us from having sometimes the really passionate and really divided conversations we need to have about the future of our church and where we're going. And so I'm all for inclusion in the sense of making ourselves accessible to everyone and open to anyone who wants to be there. But when inclusion means we simply have to settle for kind of watered down statements that look to the lowest common denominator from everyone but don't satisfy anyone's beliefs, then that is not really what it was supposed to be about to begin with. And so another piece, and this is around culture, is how we move in the UCC to a culture that isn't so afraid to have disputes, that isn't so afraid to really talk about our values and where we're going to go, and isn't afraid to have events or meetings being places where people do leave a little disturbed or uncomfortable or challenged or with food for thought, and not always feeling we just have to affirm and make everyone feel warm and happy when really there's critical times afoot. The last two, very briefly. One is too much government. And I've got a picture here, which is of all the men, and I think women as well, who had gathered for the inauguration of the United Church. Simply put, and I think a lot of folks may share this, at the moment we have a 3-tiered governance system in the church, which is so convoluted that someone like me with a PhD in politics from Oxford finds it confusing and confounding at times, and which is totally inaccessible to young people, and which to me just has way more duplication or levels of decision-making bodies than we actually need, and far too many committees and whatnot. And to me, part of how we can make decisive decision-making in the church means we have to have a more streamlined and central government. Not centralized, sorry, but a more streamlined and effective government. There were some folks at the last General Council who said, let's take, the UCC headquarters from Toronto and move it to Winnipeg. Now, I don't know if that's necessarily the best idea, but I understood where they're coming from. And sometimes I myself feel like perhaps, the challenge in anything in Canada is building national bodies in a country that's very large with very few people. And perhaps part of the answer is merging our national and our conference levels and decentralizing from one, headquarters in Toronto, but having, a series of regional headquarters which are empowered to make decisions that make sense for our regions and don't always have people flying into national events where they only get to see each other a couple times a year, and it's still very interpersonal, but to make things much more local and focused on what's going on there. The last thing I wanted to talk about was skills deficit. And this is one, I don't want to bore you all on organizational process. This is kind of the thing that I'm really into, is how organizations function and they work. But one of the major challenges I think all organizations have is, even if you have the best plans in the world, is how do you actually implement them? And throughout the UCC, whether it's at the congregational level or the national level, one of the issues I've seen is that we just don't always have the skills we need for the tasks we face. You know, a lot of folks who are in senior leadership in the church, I found we either get folks who are very well versed in theology, and that's many of our ministers and congregation, who have a first-rate training in theology, but when it comes to actually the skills of management and how to manage people, how to manage organizations, how to put together marketing plans or business plans or set up a plan for a community outreach program, have never had any professional training in that at all. And so it always takes so much longer to do these things because the folks with the greatest intentions and the best hearts may not have the hard skill to actually carry out those operations. On the other hand, I know there's also a lot of controversy, and maybe it's because people in Toronto talk a lot about the church and what they like and don't like, but where we bring in folks who do have hard skills, whether it's from the private sector or government, and know how to run operations, but don't have a firm grasp of our theology. And I really believe if we're to meet the challenges, we have to find a way to put the two together. And some of that has to go to our theology schools. I know in the 70s, for example, we had training programs in the UCC for outreach ministers. Today we don't. And so it's really kind of passionate amateurs. And one of my mentors is a man, Barry Reeder, who's done extraordinary work in Jane and Finch in his outreach ministry. But even he talks about how difficult it is because if you're a young person who wants to become part of the UCC clergy, there simply aren't those practical hands-on courses to teach you to do what you're doing. And here there are other denominations we can look to, you know, especially the evangelical churches. And this is not that I have any love for them, but I think we need to look at other models when we're thinking about our own. And certainly there, when you look at the curriculum they have at their universities, they are teaching their ministers hard skills, whether it's management skills, whether it's business skills, marketing skills, evangelism skills, whatever it is. They have whole curriculums and trainings to build people's ability to actually operationalize, to make into reality the values they have. And that was a question I constantly had at the UCC, was saying, well, we're an organization that's committed now to contesting empire. But what does that actually mean? If you know, we're saying hierarchy and hierarchical relations are part of empire, well, how does our organizational chart in the head office actually match that? And what would it look like to have an organization that had those values? You know, what does it look like for inclusion in an HR policy? What does it look like in how we kind of manage our people to have servant leadership and discipleship to Christ? These are questions that are there that I think really we have to grapple with in order to get the skills to push through some of the changes that are necessary for the church to move forward. Now that was kind of where I'll end my overall conversation, and I don't want to have left it on kind of a depressing note, but really where I'm at in front of the church is that, you know, the innovation and the change and the new styles are not going to happen at the national level, but really it has to start at the beginning, at the very foundation of church, which is at the local level, which is people gathering to try new ways to be disciples of Christ in this context of 21st century Canada. And, you know, I won't go too much into this, but that's what myself and a group of others have been gathering in my house for the last 2 months, thinking about how can we create a new congregation in downtown Toronto that would mix really engaging worship with really progressive theology. And to me, that, if there is a real future for the UCC, it's going to happen at that level, at the grassroots level, at building a new movement for renewal, for change, and regeneration of our church. And on that note, I will open things to questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kofi. I'm finding this fascinating. We've got two questions here from our participants, and I invite you to type some more in as you think of them.
I'm just seeing a big
Craig and Gary,
yeah,
and
I mean,
I've got a
I
few as well. So
perhaps,
Craig writes, do you think
sure
our worship
exactly
style is too authoritative?
using authoritative,
that is preaching about rather than
in this sense,
experiencing
as I
our faith
understand it,
together.
to me, I use the analogy of we have a worship style that's too much in the head. that I wouldn't even say preaching about, but thinking about. That we spend a lot of time, we always, I always say that it seems many of our sometimes UCC sermons are aimed at people with university degrees or master's degrees. That they are, the churches I've been in, they really deal with complex theological topics and grappling with the meaning of God, the nature of Christ, the authority of the Bible. And it's great. And it's, I love having a good think on a Sunday morning as much as anyone else. But that tends to be the end. So I totally agree with you that the experiential part of faith, the spiritual discipline, the ritualized parts of faith are things that we don't concentrate on. One of my friends who's in the UCC says he used to be a Catholic, and one of his pet peeves with the church is the fact that our liturgy or our prayers changes every single week. And he talked about how, as a Catholic, the fact that you were saying the same prayers week after week after week allowed him to experience it just as a deeper level, because he didn't need to read it off the page. You didn't need to follow to make sure you're, going along with it. You just recited it and you began to think and experience it at another level, beyond just a conscious level, but something deeper. And so that is one of the things I wonder about, is how can we keep our theology, which I think is great and is challenging and is progressive and good, but also not put all of our attention into speaking about issues and talking. Like, United Church, I love the UCC, but we love talking, we love discussions, and from national level, we love writing reports, and report after report after report. And part of my thing is sometimes we just have to do it and experience it and get out there. And that's why when I came back from Canada, I said, you know what, I don't really want to talk about the UCC anymore. Let's just start something new. Let's just do it. Let's get our hands dirty and try to make something here. And so certainly for me with the worship style, that's what I feel, is that we've got to take the emphasis off just the head and think about experiencing it in different ways, with our hearts, with our hands, with our souls.
Thank you. I wondered on that. Should we be making worship more engaging and involving more lay participation? You've probably been in a number of different churches. You say you've been across Canada. How does that work? I've been in a lot of churches that have a very clergy-centered model. So the minister gives the sermon, gives all the prayers. It's sort of a one-person show at
and
the
I think
front.
that's
and
a
I
huge
think
issue that we are
when we
very
reflect on
clergy-centered.
authority in our
And I
leadership,
think
our worship
it
leadership,
ignores
it
many of the
seems
things
to
we've
send the
learned in
message that
other
the
areas of
clergy
human
person,
learning,
the minister, is
just
the
about
one
learning
with the
itself, that
answers, so
experiential
to
learning
speak.
and
Don't know
learning
if
that
you have any
isn't
thoughts
just
on that.
this banking model where one expert passes on the knowledge and the recipients just bank it, is actually one of the least effective ways to engage people with learning. That more collaborative and collective models for learning tend to be richer experiences. And I think it's the same thing for learning about faith, is that we need to move more towards interactive. Like I used to always say, what I loved as a young person about the UCC was team talk. That as soon as the stuff started upstairs in the church, we all ran downstairs. We sat in a circle and we just discussed, things going on in our own personal life, but issues of faith. And there was no leader, there was no right answer. We just discussed it. And I always talk about that rude awakening for young people in our church when they were too old to go to teen talk and had to sit down like everyone else and just listen for 25 minutes to the sermon. And that's why many of them, within a year or two, that was the end of them doing stuff with the UCC. So I totally agree that part of that move has to be a move to where we are sharing our expression and sharing leadership, and also just discussing these things together and exploring these questions together, and not thinking we need to be led by somebody who understands these really thick theology books. And also, I think part of that is doing it in an accessible language. And that's one of the barriers when we're thinking about our own church that we want to get rid of, is there's so much theological language and UCC language that becomes a barrier for someone who hasn't been immersed in our system or our culture to even come and understand what's happening. And so to me, it's how do we make things, we open it up, as you said, and also make it accessible so everyone can feel they can join the conversation about what is the nature of God, what is the nature of building the kingdom of God today, and what are we called to be as church. those should be things we're all empowered to take part in the conversations in, and not just our leadership or our committee members or our clergy.
Yeah, thanks. And on that, I'm sure you would agree that as far as worship style goes, to be experiential, to be engaging, it doesn't necessarily need to be evangelical or drums or worship music. Certainly, that often inspires an experience of God that we don't find in many of our mainline churches in quite the same way. But I think, like you told about your Catholic friend who read those same prayers, recited them from memory week after week, there are different ways and that we can engage and have an experience of God. And I think
Yeah,
it's
I mean, I think music is
sometimes we
part of
hear
it,
that
but
it's
that's
the
right. I mean,
contemporary praise
there's
band
deep
that will
spiritual
save us,
value to
so to speak. And
silence. Like that's something I
I'm
also
sure
found
you'd
we never
agree
had
that
in
it's
my
not
AUCCs.
just one
Even with the
model,
silent
but
prayer, you start
many,
doing your
many
silent
different
prayer, and suddenly
models
the
that we
minister is
can
there
try
reading
and
a
experiment
preset
to make
prayer
our
for you.
worship more
And that,
engaging
yeah,
and
sometimes we don't
interactive.
appreciate just having silent contemplation. But I would say, and maybe this is just me, but uh, I do feel that music is a critical piece, and having kind of upbeat and rhythmic music may not be for everyone, and it's true in different contexts is there, but I think is important is to think about, what is the, and especially when we're thinking about young people, I think is critical. But you're right. I mean, there's so many different practices and ways to experience God beyond just a praise band, and it definitely shouldn't begin or end there. On the other hand, I know for me, that's one of the things, having really engaging music as someone who's listening to music my entire day, I want to feel that same motivation that I get when I listen to some Bob Marley in the morning when I'm trying to get ready for a long day at work, that I can get in a Sunday when I come in and want to sing beautiful hymns, but find myself restrained because the pace and the tempo and the beat just doesn't work for me.
Yes, I appreciate that. Now let's move on. We've got a couple questions on other topics we want to try and cover. Gary asks about buildings, being too bogged down by buildings, but who decides
Yeah,
which
I mean
building to
that is the
close?
sticky point about having
Is that a
you know
question, Gary, of
this
just
kind
trying
of
to understand
decentralized
the
model
process in the United Church,
where
or
you don't
more
have
of a
some, like you think
hypothetical
about in
who
Toronto,
should
for
be
example,
deciding?
we know that there's
Maybe
170
Gary can
public
clarify
schools
that a
right
bit,
now,
but Kofi, I'm sure
which
you have some
are,
insight.
and which are underserviced, and now there's talk about merging them and closing them, and whenever you want to merge or close something that people see as their community, excuse me, part of their community infrastructure, no one is going to like that or want that to happen. Even one of my mentors is at a church in Mimico in Toronto, and they're thinking of changing or closing the church. And there's a huge reaction from people in the community who don't even go to the church, who just like seeing it when they drive by, who've now gotten up in arms like, what do you mean you're going to take down that church? This is part of our, but they don't even go there. So yes, I mean, that is the huge problem, is that whenever these decisions are made, they're extremely difficult, and we want to empower people and be and as I'm just seeing Gary say, sorry, because I'm just reading. Yes, it can't be presbyteries or conference coming to close the church. That's not going to help. But I'm wondering if part of the answer is at least increasing the education and skill level of folks in congregation so they can understand what are your options and what are the ways you can do it. Because to me, it just seems like it's very haphazard and everyone to fend for themselves. But if you had resources made available to people, giving real plans on here's how you can commercialize part of your property in a way that will provide revenue to keep the church in place, and here's how you kind of set it up, and here are some experts who can help you go through that, and here are different ways of thinking of sharing your existing space, and here are different ways of doing redevelopment. Because to me, it seems like the system now is churches that have people with those professional skills and that business savvy and the ideas are able to find creative solutions. And congregations where they don't have that human capital are just forced to, to die a slow death. So I don't know. I mean, I would really love to hear from some of the other folks here, how we get around that. To me, that seems like an almost intractable problem. But it's really sad that we have this kind of thirst when we're surrounded by water, right? We're in a time where we think we have no resources, when in real estate, we're one of the richest organizations in Canada, if not the richest, other than, our federal government.
Thanks. One last question here, and we're almost out of time, but if you could comment on church governance. Gary writes he's agreeing with your 8 points and have come to some of the same
Okay, well, let me just
conclusions
go
in
back to,
his
because Gary, I
rural
noticed
congregation.
he's put a
They're
reply
trying to
here
change their
about
local governance and wondering how we
self-evaluation
get to
for
to
congregational
widen the
viability.
circles, the wider
And I think
circles
that
to
is a
change.
great,
So
one of the
what are
steps
your
to it.
thoughts
But it's
on
true, emotions make it
changing
very
the
difficult.
structure of the
Like as I
church?
said, with
What
my
might
own family
that look
members, seeing
like?
my
What's the
grandmother
path
and my
to
great
get
aunt,
there in 1
who,
minute?
even though they know it makes no sense for their church to remain open, they're going to cling to that building till they're forced out of it because of the deep emotional attachment to it. Um, so I mean, that is such a difficult. Yeah, self-evaluation is one way. Bringing in kind of impartial evaluators to give some thoughts and give some paths forward could be another. Um, but part of it may simply be that we're just going to see a lot of churches close, and that's just a reality we have to come to terms with. And part of it is, how do we help people, as I say, kind of die with dignity? How do we help congregations at least go through that process of closing in a way that is as least traumatic as possible? Um, so I'm just reading over Gary's point again. Yeah, I mean, in a way, I mean, I don't have a clear path, but also knowing Church House and having spent a lot of time there, my feeling is that everyone feels like the sky is falling and we have no idea where to go forward. And that if we have local churches who are coming up with new models and are showing that they're successful and showing that new ways of governance are more effective or new ways of worship are more effective, then we actually may see a lot of movement to follow by example. Because at the moment, people are desperate for someone to show a new way to kind of get this United Church thing to work right. And I mean, there are contexts where it is growing. In kind of our really growing suburban communities in the Greater Toronto area, they have packed United Churches, which is much more, I think, a factor of just the reality of those communities than what the churches are doing. But I think when it comes to governance, that I think it has to start at the local level. And I think if we have effective models, we need to create avenues and have those spaces when we have our national gatherings to bring forward models that are working and try to inspire them and share them with people. Otherwise, it's so hard. I mean, the UCC is such a massive organization. It's like the government. It's like turning the direction of an oil tanker. You try to do that on a dime, the whole thing's going to flip over. And the only way to change direction is very, very slowly in a large circle. And I think it's the same thing with UCC structures. But I think the more that we have examples that are working and the more people are actually pressing for it, the more chance we have of this being a reality. But I don't think the answer is through resolutions and trying to do it through presbytery, through conference, through general council. I think if people have new and better ways to actually be church, they should just be doing it. And if it's working, hopefully other folks will follow. But I think you could spend a lifetime trying to do resolutions on the floor of general councils and change things piece by piece. I'm sorry, I've just lost very faith in that being the way to do it as a top down. I think it has to kind of come from the bottom up.
Well, Kofi, it is 9 o'clock, and I want to thank you very much for your presentation and for your thoughts and your
Yeah,
analysis, and
well,
especially your
thank you
frankness
to
to
everyone
speak to the
else. I
United
mean,
Church about what you
I'll
see
just
the
put down
issues
my
are,
email
and
there.
to do it with so much
So
love
I'm
for the
quite
church.
happy if
So
anyone wants to
we
correspond or
appreciate
talk
that, and I
more
hope you'll come
about
join
this.
us
It's kind
again
of
sometime. And
difficult being the only one who
thank you
can
on
speak and
behalf
just
of
having to
Craig
read what
Gary
you
and
folks have
those
to
who
say.
will
But
be
you know,
watching
I'm
the
always
recorded
happy to
version
carry on the
of this
conversation
webinar.
afterwards. And it was a real
Just
pleasure
a
to be here this evening and to share with you folks.